So what subject would you like to talk about today? Yeah. Okay. Okay, soulmates. Yeah. So the overwhelming feeling is soulmates, is that? Okay, okay. Well, I'll go along with you. And we'll talk, we'll talk about soulmates. Can I just ask the question though, why is that such an overwhelming thing to talk about for you at the moment? You mean? We're needy for our soulmates, is that the... Okay. Well, that's one of the things we'll definitely need to address in the discussion. All right. Well, what I'm going to do first then is give you a little summary of the technicalities of soulmates, and then we'll get into the emotions regarding soulmates. How does that sound? It's important to understand the technicalities regarding soulmates, the real spiritual truth, if you like, the divine truth about soulmates, because it actually does affect a lot of your life without many people even knowing it affects their life. And so that's why it's quite important to allow yourself to understand the truth about how the soulmate thing works. Because what I notice a lot of times is people think that you can choose your soulmate. You know, like, oh, that guy's nice and handsome, and he's got a life, and he's quite wealthy. That's my soulmate, right? Well, that girl's got a nice figure, and you know, she's like pretty and whatever. That's my soulmate, and it's not like that at all. And then a lot of us get into this state with God with regard to the soulmate issue, because it's not like I'm choosing my soulmate. A lot of times we start feeling that we don't have free will. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, your partner's already chosen for you, so does that mean you've got free will? And that's a question that people ask, you know. They say, oh, it can't be true because we all have free will, and so therefore it would break the law of free will, so therefore this soulmate issue can't be true. Does that make sense? So a lot of times people, including my own mother actually, feels that way. So a lot of people have a lot of different emotional injuries regarding the soulmate connection, which we need to talk about. So let's look at it from a technical point of view in the first few hours or so, and then we'll go into the emotions of it all, because it's the emotion of it all that's very, very interesting. So let's start with God, who has masculine and feminine qualities, and God creates souls that all have masculine and feminine qualities. So let's grab one of those souls over there, one of God's children. And what happens now, for this, I'm going to describe the place for the description of a heterosexual soul. But that doesn't mean that, and by the way, there is no such thing as a heterosexual soul or a homosexual soul. There is just a soul that all has varying qualities of masculine and feminine characteristics. Now, when the masculine characteristics become dominant, when the soul separates into the two halves, it separates into two male forms. If the feminine characteristics are dominant, then when the soul separates, it'll separate into two female forms because the feminine characteristics are dominant. But for many souls, there's a huge range of masculine and feminine characteristics. If you draw a standard distribution curve about the issue, and let's say this is masculinity and this is femininity, right? You can see that like 80 or 90%, whatever it is in the standard distribution curve, fit between there. They will be called, when they incarnate, you could say they will be heterosexual, right? That's not how you spell heterosexual either. But anyway, it's right? And obviously on the male dominant side in this area here, the souls that incarnate there are going to be masculine, male-based homosexual, right? And obviously the souls that incarnate that have a dominant of female characteristics with some, still got male characteristics of course, but they will separate into, you could call it female homosexual, couldn't you? All right. Notice it doesn't give any room for bisexuality. which is a very confronting thing for most people nowadays, because the bisexuality movement, if we could call it that, is growing in its intensity, and it comes from a confusion of our own sexual attractions. And one of the things I'd like to talk about today is how our sexual attractions become so confused. Because the truth is that we can actually be a heterosexual soul but in a homosexual relationship and feel quite comfortable until we start opening the soulmate part of our soul. And I want to talk about that too, what that means to open up the soulmate part of your soul. Well, you can also be in a heterosexual relationship and be quite comfortable but actually be gay. You can actually be homosexual in those relationships. And this is why many grow up in a heterosexual relationship. They get to a certain point in their life where they're starting to connect to their emotions and feelings, and now they realise actually that they're not attracted to males or females, the opposite gender, but now they're attracted to the same gender. There's a reason for that, and that is usually they're more connected to their own emotions as they're getting a bit older for many of these people, and they start realising that the soulmate part of themselves has actually got this attraction. Now, the key is with all of this is God designed us in such a way that there is this huge variety of, if we could call it sexuality or gender bias, there's this huge variety of gender bias inside of inside of the souls of all of us. So some of us will have dominant masculine characteristics, some of us have dominant feminine characteristics, and there'll be this huge variety anywhere in between that. Just like there's a huge variety with music. Some of you feel like you're tone deaf and you can't sing at all, right? And others feel like totally musical. They just pick up a musical instrument, any musical instrument from any age, and away they go and play it. How did that happen? Well, that happened through a whole variety of different characteristics that come. So God's created this whole variety of characteristics in this soul. And what we're doing when we're talking about the soulmate discussion is we're focused primarily on the intergender or the sexual characteristics of the soul, if you like. Does that make sense? But in reality, the soul has lots and lots of characteristics and attributes. And by soul, I'm talking the whole soul here, not one half of the soul, which you are. I'm talking about the combination of the two halves. Because remember, how God sees you actually is not how you're currently seeing yourself. How God sees you is as this one soul, even if you're in two different physical forms. And when I say two different physical forms, once you incarnate, your half of the soul is attracted to a physical form and a spirit body form, and the other half of your soul is attracted to a different spirit body form and a different physical body form. But from God's perspective, you are still one soul. Does that make sense? Ask questions away, by the way. Microphones, if we could have one over here. Thank you. If you leave your hand up so that... That's it.
So does that mean one person's soul can only progress so far? Like, just say one person reaches the 7th sphere and the other person refuses to do anything, that then one person can't go on until the other person starts to move on?
It does mean it to a degree, but if I can describe where it stops for one person, you remember you've got the first sort of 1 to 7 spheres, and then you've got the transition into at-one-ment, which is the 8th sphere, and then you've got many other spheres up above, and then we've been calling the 22nd sphere, the transition between the 21st and 22nd sphere is a state of at-one-ment of your own soul. When you're progressing as a half of a soul, you can progress right up to the 21st sphere. But you won't be able to make the transition into the 22nd sphere without your soulmate. Does that make sense? So you can actually be at one with God while your soulmate is down in the 1st sphere somewhere. Now, in a state of at-one-ment with God, obviously you're in a state of bliss. So even if it took 1,000 years for him to get to where you are after that point, it doesn't matter too much to you. Does that make sense? But you will always be longing to progress once you connect with God. and you're progressive on the divine love path, you'll always have a desire or a longing to progress. But you'll be able to continue doing that right up to this point here, but you won't be able to go through the soul union process without your soulmate also being in that same location. But this is one thing I would like to talk to you about soulmates. As the soul progresses, as one half of the soul progresses in love, the amount of pull that they have to the other half of the soulmate is so great, it's actually the biggest pull that you'll ever have, or the biggest attraction you'll ever have to any other person aside from God in your entire life. Right? And that pull draws your soulmate into your life no matter where they are. Whether they're in spirit or they're on earth, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where in the spirit world they are, you will draw them to you at some point. Does that make sense? And that's the thing, is God designed it in such a way that you could think of it like a magnetic attraction between the two halves of the soul, and that magnetic attraction intensifies as one half of the soul grows in love. It's not very strong when both halves of the soul are not very grown in love, but as one half of the soul grows, then that attraction intensifies. We'll talk more about that, the emotion of that, as we come up.
How you doing?
Good.
Around about what sphere would you need to be in to have the identity of your soulmate truthfully revealed to you, do you think?
In the spirit world, normally that happens around the fifth sphere of the spirit world. It's not so much where you need to be, it's what state you need to be in as to when it's revealed to you. You see, for many of us have a lot of emotional injuries about having something determined for us. And when you think about it, it's the soul, which is the complete soul, that has free will, not each half. All right? Now, God gave free will to the complete unit, right? So if one half of the soul is really progressing and draws the other half into their life, the other half may think, I don't want to be drawn into their life. Why do I keep getting drawn into their life for? Well, it's their soul that's drawing them together, their own soul, and they just don't realise that, you see. And so we can't actually say that the two halves of the soul have complete independent free will. It's the complete soul itself that has free will. That's independent of every other being on the planet and in the universe, and even independent of God's will. That's what free will is. It's the complete independence. But it's the complete independence of the entire soul, not its two halves. So, in terms of when you would find out about who your soulmate is, that completely depends upon whether you're opening up the half of your soul towards the other half. In other words, opening up this electronic, if you like, or this magnetic connection between the two halves. If you open it up, and the way it's opened up is emotional, it's not opened up in any other way. Once you start opening it up, what happens is that your soulmate starts getting drawn to you, and at that point you're also usually able to know who your soulmate is. So you could be in the first sphere of the spirit world and learn who your soulmate is. Or you might be a celestial spirit and first learn who your soulmate is. There's many spirits who have become celestial spirits and who didn't know who their soulmate was until after them. Right? So it just depends on whether that part of your soul has opened up or not. Now obviously it needs to be open before you become one with God. So there's many seventh sphere spirits, I should clarify, who haven't found out who the soulmate is, but by the time they enter the celestial realm, they do know who their soulmate is. And the longings for your soulmate vary too, by the way. Obviously, if I have more emotional injuries towards the opposite gender and my soulmate happens to be a member of the opposite gender, how much of a longing am I going to have for my soulmate? Not very much, right? But if I am very open and I've started to deal with a lot of my emotional injuries about the opposite gender, I'm going to be much more open to understanding, oh, that person is my soulmate. So it just depends on my emotional openness, and we'll talk about how to emotionally open that part of your soul to the gender that is your soul mate.
AJ, if you are with somebody that you believe is your soulmate, but they're actually not, does that shut off the connection to draw your
Yes.
true soulmate to you?
Of course. Yeah. That makes sense, doesn't it? So,
Yeah, well, sorry.
Go on.
I was just going to say, I guess as we work through our injuries, then it will feel like it's not right anyway.
Exactly,
I guess. Yeah.
exactly. So there was a time in my life where I believed one person was my soulmate for nearly 7 years. And while I was believing that I'm totally shut down to my real soulmate. So she's never going to come into my life in that regard, in that place. As soon as I worked through the emotional injuries, I woke up one in the middle of the night. She's not my soulmate. And it just like dawned on me. And then I had to look at why did I want her to be? Does that make sense? So there's a lot of emotional injuries in that as to why you want somebody to be your own soulmate and you're not open to your own soulmate. So for me, it was a lot of grief that I had to work my way through after that, as a result of that realisation. But we'll talk about the emotions involved in it as we go along. Right? And somebody else, Jen, you had a question over there, up there? We can go up there first and then down here.
So it could be almost negative if you think somebody is your soulmate, and it could be just you're attracted to them because they're making you feel good because they're making you feel good in your comfort space.
Mm-hmm. And we'll talk about how that will happen in a minute when we talk about our addictions to the opposite gender.
If I progress in love on earth, my soulmate is there. Does it also automatically pull us? Or does it only happen in the spirit world?
No, it happens on
Probably
earth.
on earth as well.
Yep. And you'll feel drawn, even as you grow yourself, you'll feel drawn into making decisions and choices that lead you to where your soulmate is. So let's say your soulmate's decided to go and live in Canada, right? And you both were born here, let's say, but your soulmate decided to go and live in Canada, maybe when they were a child or when their parents decided, or maybe they just met somebody up, followed them over to Canada and they're still there, right? Then what will happen sooner or later is you'll be drawn to go to Canada. You'll feel like, for some reason I just feel like Canada is the way to go. Some place, and a lot of times it's some place way out that you'd never even consider normally. And these kind of decisions often lead you to your soulmate. And this is where we want to talk a little about the law of desire. Now, there's going to be a talk at some point about the law of desire completely, but part of finding your soulmate is about following your own desires. Because remember, if your soulmates, your own desires at some point are probably going to match the desires of your soulmate, which actually leads you together anyway. So we need to talk about that too. So anyway, so can you see firstly though, that we need to focus on the fact that we are one half of the soul. That's very important to understand. I am just one half of my soul, right? There's another person, my soulmate, who is the other half of that soul. We are one soul expressing itself in two different forms, right? The masculine in our case and the feminine form, right? And we need to remember that because it's that entire soul that has free will. And when you go through the process of a soul union, you come to understand how important it is that the entire soul has its free will rather than just the two halves. Right? Because it's that entire soul that God created in the original form that has the most power. It's also that entire soul that can grow beyond the condition of at-one-ment to God to the condition of at-one-ment with each other, and even beyond that condition as far as it is known, can grow beyond that condition. And the power of the soul in this unified state is much greater than the power of its two halves. Right? And that's why it's very important to understand I am just a half.
I was just wondering, say if your soulmate was a murderer and had murdered someone, there's obviously a penalty on that person's soul for repentance. Does that soulmate also attract that injury?
No, it doesn't. attract the injury because the way the injury enters the soul is via the connection points, and we'll talk about this in a minute. The connection points are all related to the bodies while they're connected to the physical form. So the way energy or emotions and experiences enter you is through the spirit and physical bodies, right? And enter the half of the soul. It's only when the half of the soul starts opening up towards the other half of the soul that they'll start feeling emotions coming from the other half of the soul. Now, when that starts happening, then you will start feeling whether the person's, has murdered somebody or they'd harmed somebody, or, you'll start feeling the other half, the characteristics of the other half of your soul. Whether those characteristics are actually what you would classify as like loving or unloving. So this is part of the problem, is we start opening up to the other half of our soul, then we feel a bit creepy, right? Then what you're going to be tempted to do? Start closing down towards the other half of the soul, right? Because you feel that, instead of just allowing yourself to feel those emotions, because it's the allowance of those emotions that actually triggers your soulmate into experiencing the reasons why they did things. And we'll talk about this relationship between the two halves as we go through the talk today. It's very important to understand that there is this synergy of emotional expression that goes on between the two halves, whether you are aware of it or not. All right? And for most of us, we're not aware of it. But it does happen. And the more you become aware of it, the more you can feel this relationship going on. Does that make sense? Yep. All right. So we're in the spirit world before we came to earth. At this point, remember, we did not have any consciousness of ourselves. So we didn't know who we were. So there was no self-consciousness, no self-awareness, if you like. This is before we incarnated. Obviously, we don't know how to use our free will. So basically, it's like we have no free will at this point, in the sense that we don't know how to use it because we don't even know who we are yet. Right? We also have, before we incarnate, no memory of that state because we're still not self-aware. Memory comes with self-awareness. So we're in this state, you could say we're in this created state as a unified soul, but we are yet to incarnate onto the planet to begin the process of self-awareness, to begin the process of getting to know ourselves, or as they call it in the pageant messages, as we call it there, the process of individualization. Dualization. In other words, becoming an individual. Now, the instant you incarnate, one half of the soul starts becoming the individual, and the instant the other half of the soul incarnates, that's when the whole soul now is starting the process of becoming an individual. And you finish the process of becoming an individual when you make the unification in the 22nd sphere state. All right? So you can see the first time you incarnate, you're conceived, and from that moment on, you've become an individual, right? And then that process ends, if you like, or is realised in its completion in the 22nd sphere state. So right now, none of you have yet learnt how to become an individual. Does that make sense? And the process of what we're going through is learning how to be an individual, not as a half of an individual, by the way, but as the entire soul. Remember, it's the entire soul that's individual. So what happens at that point is we are conceived. When we're conceived, obviously the soul splits into its two halves, and the first half attracts bodies that have been created for it through the sex act of the parents. And then eventually, the second half, due to the law of attraction, the second half floats around the first half until the second half also has the opportunity to incarnate into a different form created for it. So this is why many times soulmates happen to be from the same country. Right? Because there is a very, very strong attraction between the two halves of the soul right from the moment of separation.
Given that the souls are attracted to one another, what happens when a soul incarnates and it's aborted, miscarriages or dies and goes to the spirit world while the other half has still not incarnated? Does that affect anything?
No, there is still the impetus to incarnate. That has to occur for individualisation.
Sure, but is it likely to choose a situation where it won't live very long, or an unwanted pregnancy or something like that?
That depends on the personality. Remember, the personality of the soul is something that God has already created, right? And that we come to realise. So that depends on the personality of the soul in the end. So it just depends on how the unincarnated soul responds to the death of the incarnated soul. And that, of course, is going to be very different depending on what type of personality we have. Sorry, but Mary, what do you want to say? You've got a microphone over there, by the way.
It can't choose, though, can it?
No.
Would it have?
It would have a feeling.
It would have a feeling. Would it have
Yeah.
a consciousness that the other half?
Not a consciousness of the feeling,
but
a feeling.
Okay.
Because
gotcha.
remember, it can't have a consciousness of a feeling until it has self-awareness, right? The soul still has feelings, but it's just not conscious of those feelings in the unincarnated state. As soon as it incarnates, it now is conscious of the feelings that it's having. Now, when we first incarnate, the consciousness is growing. So the moment of conception, there are feelings that the soul starts absorbing from the parents and from the environment, and the consciousness of those feelings grows. So there's feelings absorbed, and we become conscious of what those feelings are. And that process of consciousness keeps growing all through your life. It doesn't stop when you become 12 or 15, and set up a relationship or something. It grows all of your life until you become at one with your soulmate in the 22nd sphere state. So the consciousness or awareness of your part of the soul and what's happening with the other part will continue to grow from the moment of conception right the way through to the moment of unification. And it will grow exponentially through that time. Every new sphere, you get a lot more consciousness of what's going on with the other half of your soul. Now everyone's cold, eh? Can somebody just turn them off up there? And we'll just keep an eye on the temperature. So just off, and because I've already said it at 26, and there's one back a bit too, Josh. There's another one up the back there. Jen, thanks. Oh, sorry, you got the mic down there.
Yep.
Go for that.
How likely is it for soulmates to come from different countries? Is it possible, and why would that happen?
Well, in today's environment, it's highly likely, because there's so much travelling going on, isn't there? And, let's look at different scenarios. A couple get together on they get married. Where do they go for a honeymoon? Oh, Thailand. Let's go to Thailand for a honeymoon. So they go for a Thailand honeymoon, and within 3 days they're pregnant, right? So where's the soulmate going to come from? Now, if it's the second half of the soul, right, that's incarnated into that pregnancy, the first half of the soul might be in Thailand. And then the people come back to Australia with their newborn child, or conceived child initially, 9 months later, newborn child. And where's the child? In Australia, but the soulmate's in Thailand. That could easily happen, could it not? So can you see, with travel and all these kind of things, we can conceivably be all over the world with regard to where we are and where our soulmate is. And so then the next question comes from that, doesn't it? How in the hell do we find them then? And it's really easy to find your soulmate. So we need to talk about that. And that's part of this discussion that we have. But remember, I'm talking about the technicals first, and then we'll talk about the emotions of it next. Can we have the mic over here? Thanks. So, go ahead, Jen.
So how does the time factor into all of this? In that between Graham and I, there's 5 years difference.
Yep.
So, how does earth time and spirit time factor into all of the incarnation process?
Well, there's no time in the spirit world, obviously, so it doesn't matter to an unincarnated spirit, particularly the fact that it's got no self-awareness. It doesn't matter to an unincarnated spirit that it's got a time frame, right? But because of the first incarnation of the first half of the soul, the second half of the soul is going to have an even stronger inclination to incarnate. And because of that, I personally have not met any soulmates that have been apart for any longer than around 30 years in terms of their incarnation period. Now, I've met in 2,000 years a lot of soulmates, obviously. So, but in terms of 30 Earth years difference in time. But it is conceivable that somebody could be longer than that. Does that make sense? It is possible. And it's possible that it could even span generations, but it's highly unlikely for a soul to remain unincarnated in the spirit world. And I've never personally seen it, even though it's possible.
So why? Why the difference in time? Is there a reason that there's a time difference or a strength in one half coming first and then the other one following? Is there any? Or
there are so many different factors involved. Well, you think about how our personalities are so different. Excuse me. Every single person in this auditorium is so different from each other, aren't we? Like, you meet somebody and you can realise there's some similarities, but wow, there's also these wide differences, isn't there, in all sorts of factors of our personality. God's created all of us in such a different state personality-wise that there are so many variable factors that depend upon the incarnation of the soul. Right from how many opportunities are there to incarnate, because you remember way back at the beginning there were less people on the earth, so therefore there were less opportunities to incarnate for a greater number of people. Does that make sense? And so obviously the time difference between the two halves may have spanned 30, 40, 50 years easily in that state. Mind you, back then men also lived longer. So, and then then the human soul degraded in its condition right down to some people only live 20 years. Now, of course, there might be, you know, so they might not have even found each other in their incarnate form if people only live 20 years lifespan due to their emotional injuries. So can you see there's just so many variable factors? The key to understand it is in the end, you're always going to meet your soulmate. Whether it's here or in the spirit world, you're always going to meet them. But the chances of you meeting them are much greater if you open up the soulmate part of your soul. And we'll talk about that in the emotional discussion. Does that make sense? Yep.
Going back to the personality of the soul,
yep.
As an unincarnate soul,
yep.
then would the gifts and the personality and potentials of that soul are the same for two of them, or would they have, for example, if you had one, the gift of artistic gift, would that artistic gift be in both when they incarnate, or would some get, just like genetics, like one would get some and one wouldn't get any, or how?
Well, again, that varies very much between each individual soul. How the soul itself splits in its characteristics and attributes is an individual process for each particular soul. So, but you will find that there is always generally a correlation of desires between the two halves. So let's say one of the part of the soul is passionate about music, and so they get into guitar and away they go with that, and you know, they do all of that kind of stuff. Then there's a higher likelihood that the other part of the soul is also going to have some kind of passion for music as well. Does that make sense? And that eventually is found. But a lot of times our passions get stomped on from our childhood onwards, and so we don't know our passions until we start freeing up our emotional state. And so that person may not have realised that passion yet. And so this is why it's very hard to judge from an imperfect state where we're not yet very developed in love, that our soulmate would have a certain thing or characteristic, because we ourselves, because of the development in love, may not easily recognise the characteristics even that we have within ourselves, let alone the characteristics of our soulmate. But yes, the personality is for the entire soul, and how the personality splits between the two halves is very, very dependent upon how God created that soul in its split. From an energetic perspective, if you can think of it like a soul, like a big ball, if you like, of energy, with all this electrical energy going between the two, and then it separates, but all of these electrical lines, if you like, or energetic lines, are all still going between the two halves. Now, obviously, there's going to be very much a synergy between the two halves in terms of their desires, passions, longings, intentions. Lots of different parts of the soul are all going to have very similar natures, if you like, involved in that. And so, obviously, that connection is maintained throughout your entire development as long as you are staying in touch with your emotions, your desires, your passions, your longings. The more I detune from my emotions and passions and desires, the more I also detune from my soulmate. So if I'm very intellectual, very shut down emotionally, I am going to actually be pushing away my soulmate, because I will not even be able to usually recognise my soulmate in that state, because I'm not having that connection to myself. And remember, a connection to yourself is also similar to a connection to the other half of yourself, because your soulmate is your other half of you at the emotional level. Does that make sense?
Yeah. But intelligence wouldn't be, is intelligence something that comes in with the soul as well? With the
intelligence is vastly controlled by emotional injuries, right? So many, and you'll see this more and more as people grow in the spirit world. They become more and more intelligent, and they become less guided by the emotions that shut down intelligence. So, how many of you hate mathematics? About half, maybe a bit more than that, of the audience, right? Okay. How many of those people who hated mathematics were no good at mathematics? Isn't that interesting? Almost all of them, right? Now, can you see the relationship between that? There is an emotional relationship between the fact that we dislike something and that we're no good at it, right? And the same applies to all forms of what we now classify to be intelligence. There is always an emotional reason why we get shut down in our intelligence. And so many of the people who you judge as not very intelligent actually have quite a few emotions that have caused them to shut down their intelligence. Because actually God created the soul with very powerful intelligence. But it's all emotional, and this is why when we get the emotional damage, the intelligence often gets shut down as a result. Also, there is this multi-generational injury that occurs where intelligence is glorified and emotional intelligence is denigrated. You notice that? Isn't that still really the case? How many times do you go along to a university course teaching you to be emotionally intelligent? Not very often, right? But you do have lots and lots of university courses on all sorts of things, how to become a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, right? And all of these other things too, like psychiatrists, psychologists. And how many of those things talk about emotional connectiveness? Well, you can go along and even be a psychologist and still not learn about that, right? So there is this really big focus today on the intellect, which actually, in most cases, doesn't connect to people who have been shut down intellectually at a young age due to emotional injuries. And we then judge those people as they're not very intelligent, when in reality, the potential of their intelligence is just the same as our own. Right? So the truth is that your soulmate may appear initially to be quite unintelligent if you are intelligent, but as they grow and connect to their emotional reasons why they had that belief of themselves and release that, their intelligence will grow as a result. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So again, why judge your soulmate based on intelligence? Can you see how a lot of times our judgments are based around the emotional impact of the emotional injuries we received rather than the truth? Yep. So when it comes to visiting or seeing your soulmate, you're going to have to be very open emotionally to your soulmate potentially being anyone. Isn't that interesting?
Hi, AJ.
What would the complications of in vitro fertilisation with not knowing who the donor would be? How would that pan out?
Anything that happens at the physical level is immaterial from this perspective.
Well, when you said that the parents would, through their emotions, attract that soul. So there's two parents. What about the parent of the...
Well, obviously the parent of the genetic donor there's the genetics coming from that parent, and those genetics have emotional things that created them, right? So obviously the emotional things that created the genetics that were then given to the donor will have an effect on the child.
So would the emotional...
But how does that affect the soulmate?
Well, yeah.
It doesn't really, does it?
Well, I wondered how the connection, if there was an emotional connection between the donor and the parents, and then if there was a complication further than that. I don't know. No.
The way God's created it is if somebody incarnates, so whether they do it in vitro or whether they do it, you know, as or any other way, when they incarnate, they still absorb emotion from their environment just the same as before. Part of that emotion is the genetics from the previous history of emotions of previous generations and so forth. But that has no effect on who your soulmate is in the end.
So it's quite simple, still quite simple.
It's still very, very simple. No matter what man does regarding this issue, like man could actually genetically clone you and actually clone you into another living person, and you're going to be very different because the two halves of your soul are going to be very different, right? And they're going to be completely two halves of completely different souls with completely different personalities. It's the same with twins, right? Twins are incarnated into the same cell even, right? In terms of the way the cell starts breaking up. If twins are incarnated once they start splitting into the two different forms. They're very close to each other genetically, but have you ever met any identical twins that are identical emotionally? No, right? They have many identical feelings based upon their genetic imprint, their emotional imprints from their environment, but they are very, very different. My own daughter is a twin, an identical twin, in this incarnation, and she is very, very different from her twin, who is in the first incarnation. Does that make sense? My own daughter from the 1st century, Sarah, reincarnated onto the planet, and she is a twin of somebody who incarnated in the first incarnation. Is it all getting too complicated? In other words, she's reincarnated, but her sister is not reincarnated. But they are identical twins, physically, but very, very, very different emotionally. Right? So what happens at the physical level is almost immaterial to this discussion. Does that make sense? And this is the thing we've got to get away from, you see. We're constantly focused on, there's two men there and they're attracted to each other. Isn't that bad? Like we have all this judgment about homosexuality, right? God doesn't have any judgment about that. God's got the two halves of the soul perfectly designed. All he cares about is what happens at the soul level. He's created this beautiful way of incarnation to learn about ourselves. Everything happens perfectly. And the only time it doesn't happen perfectly is when the environment has all of these emotional damage that gets then put onto that child, onto that younger soul, if you like. That's when imperfections arise. So that's when we have things like gender, body mutation type things occurring because of the huge impact of emotional injuries that we have about sexuality here on the planet, where people want to become transgender, for example, right, because of huge emotional things that have been put upon them by their environment. Because from God's perspective, all of us would know exactly what our gender attraction is, whether it's male, female. Doesn't matter whether we're male, female. Our attraction can be male or female, and we'll know specifically what it is, and we'll know that it will not waver once we know. Before that time, you might cycle between being like bisexual or going to a male or going to a female sexually or whatever, but as soon as you open this soulmate part of yourself, you will know for certain what the other half of your soul is in terms of its gender. Yep. Yeah. Okay, so remember, physical things here, not really very important. None of you believe that. Go on.